consideration has become. We were getting into some of the sort of variations on this, like forbearance, and we're picking up with past considerations. So if you recall, we started the discussion of consideration with a few key principles, one of which was past consideration is not good consideration. And we have the case of Eastwood in Kenya as the first case. What happened here? Eastwood versus Kenya under past consideration. There was one message we had to read from the textbook.
Paid for education of this daughter,
Yeah.
and she promised to pay him back. And then she got married, and her husband also promised to pay back the executor.
Eastwood. Eastwood was the executive.
And then no one paid him.
Right. So, to be clear, what we're looking at here is an executor having spent some of his own money, he borrowed the money to do this, to one, improve the cottages on the estate for the daughter's benefit, and on her education, so that would improve her marriage prospects. This was what was specified to. And the court said there was no consideration for this promise. Why is there no consideration here? He borrowed the money, and he didn't put it towards himself, he put it towards the daughter, and he was the executor of the estate, so he was doing things for the benefit of the estate. It wasn't like he was deriving a personal benefit. So, if we kind of use the loose language of benefit detriment, certainly he suffered a detriment here. And he was promised by two different people that he'd be reimbursed. But when he brought it to court, the court said Eastwood, the promises for Eastwood were unsupported by consideration. Why?
It's the past consideration and non consideration.
That's right, I picked up on that. But
I don't understand.
Okay, so if we step back from the case and we think of why would the common law create this rule of past consideration not being satisfactory? Remember, we talked a bit about, I think yesterday even, we talked about courts being concerned about setting precedents. So if the court said it's okay for past consideration to constitute good consideration, what could be the precedent? What could be the problem that they're trying to avoid?
Maybe like promises done like in other times, like between two people, like I promise to do something for offer some service, and then 2 years later, the other person promises something else, and then could be enforced.
So I'm sure you've all had friends that said, remember that time I was really good to you 2 years ago? Now's the time to pay me back. I need X amount of money. So the court is concerned about that kind of a scenario where you're sort of, the modern term will be guilt tricked into a contract. And recall, so things I hope are maybe hopefully coming together. Why is that so important for the common law? Well, it's because you can't accidentally fall into a contract. The principle of a contract is you've agreed to the obligations. So to allow for past consideration to be good consideration allows for this sort of backdoor way of forming a contract that the court is antithetical to how the courts look at contracting. Because recall, and we'll see this, I think a bit more next week, once you're in a contract, the courts aren't going to let you out of it. So, sort of coercing someone or guilt-tripping them into a contract goes against that whole idea of voluntarily entering into an obligation.
Also,
Yeah.
if it's past consideration, there's no way that that consideration can be an element of the contract being formed in the now.
Yeah. So, just reading an excerpt from Chief Justice Denman, who gave the decision, the enforcement of such promises by law, however plausibly reconciled by the desire to effect all conscientious engagements, might be attended with mischievous consequences to society, one of which will be the frequent preference of voluntary undertakings to claim for just debts. So, sort of in 19th century language, that's what Denman is talking about, is what we just elaborated upon. So this idea that if we step back a bit and look at it as, well, we have this idea of consideration and something of value passing to the party. Arguably in Eastwood, something of value passed to the daughter. Her education and improvements on the cottages. But here we see a line being drawn, and the rationale for that line is what we have just discussed. That there's no intention to come into that obligation. It's done in the past. What you have to do is, at the moment you're doing it, you have to get an agreement. Now the problem with Eastwood is the daughter was a minor, and minors can't contract, so it'd be unenforceable. But what complicates this idea is we can kind of come up with circumstances that maybe past consideration should be good consideration. And as we have with the English language, there are lots of exceptions to things in the common law. And past consideration is one of them. We have the case of Lampley and Braithwaite from the 17th century, which underscored this idea that maybe there are certain circumstances when past consideration would be good consideration. For example, the defendant killed someone and asked the plaintiff to obtain a pardon for him from the king. The plaintiff obtained that pardon, but the defendant didn't pay. So the question is, was there an obligation here? And the court said there was. Because in the court's view, it was part of a continuing transaction. The defendant asked the plaintiff to do something with the implied, at least, promise that there be some sort of reward or reimbursement for the effort. And we have the Reed Casey's patents case. But how on is where things get very complicated, I would say. They get complicated in part because factually, I think this case is a bit complicated. So let's make sure we're clear about what has happened factually and how long. What do you think happened here? I ask that just because, as I say, the facts can be a bit confusing. So even if you think you're a bit off, we'll work through it.
House, you said?
Pow on.
Ah, that's what you wanted to do, okay?
You said that we'd look at it later,
Yes, yes.
later
And
tonight.
that was where there were two companies, one is private and one is okay, so there was one private company whose asset was building construction, right? Not there yet.
Yep.
And they wanted to sell it to a public company. And this public company, instead of paying, they wanted, basically they paid by shares of the public company.
Why?
But,
Why was this done as a share transaction?
um,
What were they concerned about?
I know that they want the delay, why they wanted to pay 60% of the shares later, because they didn't want the prices of the shares to drop.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they were concerned about
The price.
all
of the
these shares being traded and people thinking, well, something's going on.
Yes. So then this Power On, which was a private company, agreed to this, but then realized that that's a risk for him, because what if the price of the shares will change till it was half a year later, right? We
Yeah.
wanted half a year later to get the money, but what if the shares are changing?
Yeah.
So they got into a second agreement. This second agreement was basically saying that they agreed that it should be protected against the loss from the possible fall. But then he realized that, okay, that protects him if the price falls, but what if the price rises? Then he will not get his profit.
Yeah.
So then, basically, he blackmailed a little bit his company. He said that he's not going to comply the original agreement unless they cancel the secondary agreement and write a new one in which he promised that in case the price are lower, then he will pay the difference to 2.5, whatever, to the price, which was the price of the original agreement. And of course, in case it's higher, then he can just sell for the higher price. Now what happened that the price dropped, and he wanted to get his difference,
Yeah.
but he didn't get it. And that's when
The
he
other
started
party
to-
refused.
Yes, the other party refused, and then he went to court.
So I think the way I look at this, maybe it's oversimplifying it, but one of the parties here, the purchasing party, in English we have this phrase called sucking and blowing. Have you heard of this?
Very nice.
Think of a straw. Think of a straw. You can't simultaneously suck and blow, right? That's what I see the purchaser doing here. And it's sort of, I don't understand what the purchaser was thinking, because they go through all this trouble. They're concerned about a loss. So they say, well, any loss is your fault. Okay. But then a few months later, they figure out, wait a minute, the stock market can go up. So I want that. So they say, well, you better agree to this because I want the profit, and if you don't give it to me, then there's an economic duress aspect to this. So I think part of why it's complicated is it's kind of illogical what the purchaser did. It was kind of like an amateur, I say. Like who thinks of only losing money, but not the increase in the money? I don't understand what they were doing. In any which way they wanted, as the saying goes, they wanted everything. They wanted no losses and all the profits. So why is this a past consideration case?
Because when they were negotiating the agreement, they did not provide any
and they wanted to hide any profits, it was just a promise, okay, I'll give you the profits. But there was no consideration going to the vendor for those profits, ever.
But how is it like different from promising extra? Okay, away from the economic duress, okay? But
Yeah, well, it's different. So Ebra's question kind of goes to, if you recall, Williams and Rocky Brothers, paying extra, sort of a classic example. There, Rocky Brothers voluntarily offered to pay extra. And the Court of Appeal, if you remember, said there was consideration in the form of this practical benefit. In Powon, we don't have that. There, even though it's 10 years, 11 years before Williams and Rocky Brothers, there's no argument for new consideration.
But it's only the secondary agreement, right?
Yeah.
We're talking
The
about the
problem.
change of the secondary agreement.
Yeah. So, is there consideration here? What does the court, the Privy Council find? Go ahead. Sorry.
This case is a bit analogous to the case of Scottson and Peggy.
Hey,
Yeah, Peg. So in both of these cases, one performance of one duty serves as consideration for two contracts. In the Scottson case is that the consideration for both the original buyer and the assignee of the buyer. And in this case is that both to the public company itself and the major shareholder of the public company who provide the promise to protect the downside risk.
right.
Yeah.
So, remember we just talked about Lampley and Braithwaite. We have that 17th century precedent that says, if this is a continuing act, even though it's in the past, that satisfies consideration. So the Privy Council here lays down new law, a three-part test. It says, here's a test regarding past consideration. You have the excerpt in your book, your textbook, but I'll read it to you. An act done before the giving of a promise to make a payment or to confer some other benefit can sometimes be consideration for the promise. The act must have been done at the promissor's request. The parties must have understood that the act was to be remunerated either by a payment or the conferment of some other benefit, and payment or the conferment of a benefit must have been legally enforceable had it been promised in advance. So you need all three of these features. And the Privy Council says these are all present. So an act done at the promisor's request, the promise given under the main agreement not to sell the shares for a year is at the first defendant's request. The parties understood at the time of the main agreement that the restriction on selling must be compensated for by the benefit of a guarantee against a drop in price. The act was remunerated, and just, again, I'm reading from the case. The expressed consideration includes a reference to the plaintiff's promise not to sell the shares before a certain date, promise to be performed in the future, though given in the past. It is not possible to treat the defendant's promise of indemnity as independent of the plaintiff's antecedent promise. And then payment must have been legally enforceable had it been promised in advance. And they say it would have been if it had been promised at the time. So what we look for here is we have this rule. Past consideration is not good consideration. The question is, when does the exception come in? The exception comes in when the facts fit the criteria, the three-part criteria of Powell. So in this small example, we have what happens often in the common law. We have this rule, and then we have factors that distinguish the rule. We have a rule from Eastwood and Kenyon, but Powon says you can distinguish Eastwood and Kenyon depending on the facts if these three factors are satisfied. So just with the topic of consideration, I think we have a lot going on here. And I don't know, some people are visual learners, but at this level you know how you learn best. But the idea is that consideration is something of value. It needs to be sufficient, but need not be adequate. We don't really have a floor to that other than white and blue it. So it seems like there's quite a bit that could be considered consideration, something of value. What reinforces that point, I suggest, is Williams and Wealthy Brothers. This idea of a practical benefit seems to extend the idea of consideration. And what we learn is from Greater Fredericton, from New Brunswick, the only bar to that, or the only parameter, seems to be right now at least, economic duress, where there is coercion of some kind, compelling the other party to sign on to the agreement. But this idea of something of value has for a long time been a bit of a problem, as we see with past consideration. Because there can be something of value conferred. It depends on the circumstances. So the way we treat that now is through the three-part test in Powon. We talked at the end of class yesterday a bit about forbearance. Forbearing or refraining from doing something, for example, bringing a lawsuit, can be something of value. So we see distinctions starting to be made with some case law behind them. And I go through that in order to introduce the concept of promissory estoppel. If I said promissory estoppel is an exception to consideration, using the High Trees case, Central Property Trust versus High Trees, how can we see
that the rent will be half as before, and it was going on, but the war has finished, and after 1945, the occupancy went full again. And so the defendant, the plaintiff wanted the full rent again. But the defendant said that no, he thought that the agreement was for the whole term of the lease. And that was the argument. So the question is, with this past consideration, that when we are talking about in 45, we are talking about the consideration happened 4 years ago, right? 4 years ago they agreed on something. The term of the agreement, the change of the terms was not expressively, it was not clearly expressed. And for how long? The full term only for the war finishing. And but now, okay, so, and then came up this estoppel, where basically Lord Denning said, on base of equity,
Yeah.
that it just wouldn't be fair to pay half rent now,
Right.
when already the consideration 4 years ago is already not consideration anymore.
So just, I'll add, Sparta.
Yeah, there was another technicality in there because the first agreement was made under seal, and the second agreement violated the power rule, so, I mean, this idea of the stop really.
No, so there were two different property managers. One made the agreement to have the rent. A new property manager came in and said, going forward, you owe us the whole rent, plus you owe us that 50% for each of the preceding years. So the tenant is saying no. In terms of consideration, what's the problem here?
No consideration?
Right, there's no consideration for having the rent.
Yeah, well, actually, the landlord and the tenant, they were, I think, a principal and subsidiary corporation. So they were kind of looking after them in the sense of helping them out. Although there was no any formal agreement, but they wanted to help its subsidiary to, survive through the tough times.
Yeah, well, they were having trouble keeping people in the building because it so happened Germany was bombing the building. So they have the rent to keep them in. Could that be seen as just them sticking around? Is that consideration?
Not at all. In a real old-fashioned sense, no.
Yeah,
There's no value from the promisee. There's no value from the tenant in terms of the rent being low. Nothing's been offered in exchange,
yeah,
other than brotherly love.
yeah. Well, and
Maybe hugs and a couple of beers.
well, I think there were rations at this time.
Oh, Russia. Then vodka, of course. Now we're talking.
They, this argument, so Lord Denning didn't find any consideration here. So we're clear, there's nothing being passed from the tenant to the landlord. Ever?
Yeah, but is it, sorry, isn't it like a continuing transaction because he's still like paying the rent?
Yeah, well, this isn't a matter of past consideration. So this is separate. So that's why I started this by asking, how can we see promissory estoppel as an exception to consideration? Because past consideration still is consideration. But in High Trees, using it as an example of promissory estoppel, we have no consideration whatsoever. There is no argument for consideration. All that we have, as Ita said, is Lord Denning, he became Lord Denning later, saying, well, this is not equitable. And as I said, in this course, I'm not going to go into detail about equity, because I'm not sure where people are at. Some haven't done property and so on. For a loose translation, we'll say equity is fairness. The Lord Denning is saying here, this is not fair. This is not fair for the tenant, because the tenant was told, pay 50% of the rent. It's okay. They rely on that to their detriment. And then all of a sudden, the landlord changes its mind. Now, as I said, I know there are two different property managers here, but for legal purposes, it's the same entity. So there's something unjust happening here. So Lord Denning, as he often tries to do, tries to rectify the matter. And he says, well, there's this concept called promissory estoppel, or estoppel, more generally. He draws it from the Hughes and Metropolitan Train case from the late 19th century. And he says, well, when there's an injustice here, the courts can step in, because by this time the courts, the common law court, king's courts and the equity courts have been merged. So common law courts have the power of both. So he says, I'm devising a new test, which I've outlined for you in the notes at the start of the promissory estoppel, under the heading promissory estoppel requirements. There must be an existing contract between the parties. The promisor must have made a clear and unambiguous promise to the promisee as to the promisor's future conduct, to the effect that the promisor will not insist on his strict legal rights as against the promisee. The promisor must intend her promise to be acted upon, and the promisee must in some way have acted in reliance on the promisor's promise. Now, I see, I've noticed a quick look around, some people are using different textbooks. Promissory estoppel, some texts will say there are 5 points, some will say there are 4. I've said there are 4, only because I think those that say that there are 5 have 2 are combined in one of the 4. So you're looking for these requirements. However you look at them, if you see them as 4 or 5, they're still the same requirements. So here, applied to our tenancy case, Lord Denning says all these criteria are met. Therefore, the landlord is promissorily estopped, if we conjugate it, from what? What is the landlord estopped from?
From claiming the past rent, and you know that you want
Right.
to get.
But what about the rent going forward?
That's fine, because he gave a notice, so.
Right.
Because there was full tenancy, like there was full
Yeah.
occupation of the building, they said it's fair that the full rent is charged.
Now, an ambiguity in promissory estoppel is whether or not you must give notice. So here, in the agreement, as Zita said, it was a bit ambiguous. So here, do we say, well, the Second World War stops and then it goes back to 100% rent? Or must the landlord say, okay, the war is stopped and we're going back to the original agreement? Yeah.
I think there is no ambiguity. No. Because it was implied that the circumstances of the war were responsible for the
Sure.
reduction of the land. So it would be expected.
This is why I'm saying it's ambiguous, though, in terms of whether or not you have to give notice. I think, Enrico?
I'm thinking in the sense of Lord Denning's strive to always find equity.
Yeah.
It makes sense that you wouldn't have to, as my colleague here was just saying, that, things change, circumstances change. It's fair not to allow one person to unjustly enrich himself for arrears. There's a promise and Christian life, and at the same token, it would only be fair that if the situation went back to the way it was, that the landlord would be able to rely on that change in circumstance. So
Yes.
it's again, look at that and say that's a fair equity.
The way I put it is, I think if you're advising the landlord in this case, in this situation, you tell them to give notice. It doesn't cost anything to send a letter saying we're going back to the original agreement. And it I would say arguably at least, avoids this issue of, well, you didn't tell me. Constantina's point is, well, I don't need to tell you. Everybody knows the war is over. And the agreement was, when the war ends, your rent goes back up.
But wasn't there a demand to pay for the past rent? That should
Right, but I'm
substantiate the
separating,
notice.
I'm separating the point. So in high trees, we have two payments, let's call them. The arrears and then the future rent. So the arrears, the landlord is promissory stopped from collecting. But then my question was, well, procedurally, if you will, does the landlord have to give notice? It isn't clear that the landlord does, but let's say this is an exam question or you come up with this in practice, I would say the most prudent way to look at this is to give notice. Just to avoid the issue of whether or not I had to give notice.
Well, what if you're facing a limitation and there is no time for a notice? Why then the landlord would be exposed to losing the cause of action?
I'm not saying they're losing the cause of action. It's a matter of when does the rent go back up? Is it automatic, or do you say, okay, this month we're starting back to the original rent? That's the question I'm posing. So if you want to calculate it, let's say, what's that? Stake is a month's rent at 100%. So however you want to handle it, you can say, well, war is over. Same day you give the notice. At the end of this month, I expect 100% rent. However you handle it. All I'm saying is I think it'd be the prudent thing to give notice because the case law doesn't speak with finality on this point.
Doesn't Briscoe answer that point when it speaks of the promiser can resile from his promise if he takes reasonable notice? A J.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just rereading it to make sure. I don't know if a
Trouble.
yeah, it's not definitive, I would say.
But it's a 1964 case from the...
No, I don't mean definitive as to the level of court. The promisor can resile from his promise on giving reasonable notice. The thing is, in high trees, with those facts, does the landlord have to give notice? If they say, end of the Second World War, we're going back to 100% rent. Briscoe is saying that you can withdraw from it. So if we change the facts and the landlord says, in 1944, I'm going back to 100% rent, here's the notice. They can do that. But the particular facts of high trees are what I'm asking about. Does the landlord at the end of the war have to say, here's notice? Or do they say, end of the war? And what I'm saying in terms of the prudent point is, I think you just give the notice. However brief it may be. Spartak?
Yeah, absolutely, because when the Second World War was finished, when they did the second agreement, they were uncertain as to where the war was going to finish, so they couldn't anticipate that. So there was nothing in the second agreement, so to speak, to obligate the party to give notice for like this decade development.
It was left open.
Yeah.
And so just as a general approach, if there's ambiguity, resolve it, is what I'm saying. If you're the landlord, you have the right to raise the rent back. You tell them we're going back. So there's no doubt as to what's happening. Like, what, put another way, why let it be an issue? That's what I'm suggesting. I know it may seem like a small point, but what I found is when people started studying for promissory estoppel, this question came up. So I thought I'd deal with it this way now. Dale?
Just a quick question. Under the circumstances of the war in London between 1941 and 1945,
Yes.
wasn't there any regulatory recommendation or anything actually adjusting the rents and stuff? Because it looks crazy that someone has to pay the full rent and the building is getting bombed. It looks like a risk majeure to me, or risk major, however you call it. And the landlord, obviously, if there was no any regulatory notice or recommendation or something waiving the rights during the wartime in London, then it's a common sense. It's the,
It seems as though that wasn't the case here. This was an ongoing tendency. So when you talk about force majeure or frustration of contract, something unforeseen happens. So if somebody can't fulfill the tenancy because of the war, that would be different, but we don't have that with high trees, right? We have a continuing tenancy.
tenants in the basement, I guess.
So the question here is, that you're asking, is there anything that was done by the government in it? I
For the public notice, so to speak.
Yeah,
Just a question.
yeah, I infer not from the facts here. Tamesh.
David, the objective of the notice, reasonable notice,
Yeah.
it's not just information. It's really, the objective is to put back the promisee to the position they were in. In fact, that's Briscoe actually emphasized that point. In other words, they were suffered a detriment because of an altered situation. You couldn't renege from the promise. But now that you have an opportunity to put them back in the position when they're not going to be in detriment. So that's, you need the time.
Yeah,
for it.
but it's all on the landlord in high trees.
No, I know, but I'm saying as a matter of principle, the reason for reasonable notice, there's an objective behind that.
Yeah,
It's not just, information.
no, but I didn't think I was saying
No,
something
no,
different.
okay, you're sort of debating whether notice should be given or not.
In the high trees example,
That's in 1947, but come in 1964, they're making the point quite clear.
different facts though, right? Again, I've said it a few times. In the high trees case, the question is, did the landlord have to give notice at all? The war ended. And all I'm saying is, when there's an ambiguity like that, the prudent course of action would be to give notice. Briscoe says the landlord can resile at any time as long as they give notice.
Reasonable.
And I'm not debating that. Again, it's turning on the particular facts of high trees. Just as the question that I'm going to pose, what happens in promissory estoppel? Are the landlord's rights extinguished or suspended? They're suspended, but if we look at high trees, in fact, their entitlement to the back rent, I'll call it, was extinguished. So there are a number of things that I'm unpacking from the high trees case, because using it as an example of promissory estoppel can complicate things. It can look as though promissory estoppel extinguishes rights if you look only at the high trees case and focus on the back rent. But that's not the case. The back rent was lost by operation of the agreement. So here we have an exception to consideration, the initial question I posed, because the tenant gave no consideration for the lower rent. Therefore, promissory estoppel is an exception to consideration, and it comes into effect, as Lord Denning said, when it be inequitable for the promisor to reassert her rights. And we see an example with the back rent and high trees of that.
So sorry, is it a prerequisite then for promissory estoppel there to be no consideration? Is that?
Yeah, but remember, the first point, or first requirement is there's an existing agreement. So you can't perfect or form a contract through promissory estoppel. This is about amending the terms of a pre-existing contract.
Well, there are some cases about even government providing certain positions. It escapes my mind, but in the book, there is a case versus the Ministry of whatever, deciding that impairments are a result of a qualifying injury for the benefit and then trying to reverse, and promissory estoppel is found to actually bind that administrative relationship rather than a contract per se.
Yeah, although we do have another example that says there wasn't an agreement. I think
Oh,
we looked at it
yeah, I
before.
don't doubt that decisions don't go both
Depends on
ways
the
at the
facts.
same time,
Yeah.
always. But I'm just saying, it's not just the contract, it's also an administrative relationship between the government and the claimant who is going through the process.
Mhm. Just trying to look at, I'm not sure if doing another case would complicate things, or if we're in a good place with promissory estoppel and we don't dig a deeper hole. Dayon has told me not to.
I'm hoping, I'm claiming mercy, or clemency, or however you
Okay.
want to call it.
The only thing I'd add is the Koom and Koom case. A very famous statement coming out of promissory estoppel is you cannot use promissory estoppel as a sword, only as a shield. What does that mean, do you think? Even if you haven't heard it before.
Well, the cause is separate cause of action.
Right.
You cannot issue a claim and pursue your rights based on what you can expect from promissory estoppel. You can only defend
Yeah.
the action that is contrary to the estoppel being caused by the promise and reliance. That's my understanding.
Yeah. And in Canada, there hasn't really been a resolution to that point. In Australia, we have the Walton case where they say you can use it as a sword and not just as a shield. But in Canada, it's not clear. So what do you take from that? You could make the argument of promissory estoppel as a cause of action, but it would be a very high bar to surpass because of the length of time of the case that's been there. Any questions before we move on to privity of contract? So what's privity of contract?
It means that the parties who sign the agreement, so they can raise any issue related to the contract.
Right,
And
so
also the-
only the parties to a contract can sue based on the rights in the contract. Tweedle and Atkinson. Why could the plaintiff not sue in this case? Tweedle versus Atkinson. It should be the first case.
So in this case, the parents of a son and daughter who were getting married, they promised to give some, to pay some money to the couple. And actually both fathers died before they were able to pay. So the groom brought a claim against the executor of the youth for the amount to be paid, and the court said that he was not a party to the original agreement. So he couldn't sue.
So Tweedle is our authority. So if we have a case where the argument is privity of contract, Tweedle is our authority for that. That anyone who wasn't party to the contract is barred from suing based on it. So does Beswick and Beswick change that?
Can I just go back to Tweedle and Atkinson?
Yeah.
I don't know enough property law to answer this, but doesn't the son enter into all of his father's legal positions if he's the heir of his father?
If he was, but you can have an executor.
So in this case, he's not the heir, he's
If he was the heir,
then
he
it
would
would be an
have
issue, right?
right, and that's why we're going to the Beswick case. Because that very point comes up.
And another question I asked myself was, if there was no consideration here, it couldn't be an agreement, right, between the fathers, but could it still be a gift from the daughter's father to the other father?
It could be a gift, that wasn't the claim here.
I know, just from my understanding.
Yeah, theoretically, it could be a gift. We'd be going into more property law, but in terms of the contract, you can't.
Yeah, I think we touched on this yesterday, but did we say a gift is not enforceable?
Yeah, in contract.
But I'm saying that there is no consideration if both fathers agreed to pay.
Well, who's suing in Tweedle?
So there
Right.
was consideration.
Yeah, but this is what privity of contract is about. Two fathers make an agreement, but the groom is the one that they're going to pay. Can the groom sue? And the groom can't.
The
Yeah.
consideration point, because people said that there was no consideration in this case.
It was a hypothetical question, I'm sorry. It was a hypothetical question.
He was related to the gift point. or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
He was trying to say, could we go outside of contract? I think,
Yes,
more or less.
that's what I was saying.
Beswick. As I said, does Beswick change what we're saying about third parties in privity? Taylor?
Yes, so in this case, he was in his house, so he promised the nephew to transfer the trade to the nephew on the basis that the nephew will employ him as a consultant and later on will pay for his wife. After he passed on, so the nephew paid for one time, and then PD's widow brought an action as an administrator of his estate, and also as a person capacity training for specific things. And the court says that yes, the widow has the right to brought an action as an administrator of the estate, however, she doesn't have the right in her personal capacity training.
Right. So Beswick reasserts privity of contract. The wife was not party to the contract between her husband and the nephew, but, and this is why I mentioned it in relation to Nicholas' point, she was the administratrix of the estate and sued here in that capacity for what's called specific performance. Have you heard of this before?
Yeah. I covered it.
So she got around privity of contract because she was the administratrix of the estate.
Well, Lord Manning was giving her right to sue in her personal capacity as well.
Lord Denning does stuff like that.
So luckily,
That's why he was overruled.
other people.
Because the reason he was overruled was the court is saying there's privity of contract. We can't just throw her into this. It's despicable what the nephew is doing, but we can't just modify it here. You've probably heard the adage, sad facts make for bad law, something like that. Sad facts or bad facts makes for bad law. You know, where you have a very sympathetic plaintiff, like Ms. Bestwood, judges can contort themselves to give a remedy, as Lord Denning did at the Court of Appeal. But Lord Reed at the House of Lords is saying, that's nice, but you're going to unsettle this concept of privity of contract. And in fact, we don't need to do that to give her a remedy because she's the administratrix. Yeah.
I don't want to throw a screw in the works. I don't want to throw a screw in the works.
Yeah, yeah.
I probably don't know enough about this case. I did it when I was in London. I haven't reread it since. I apologize. But it strikes me that if she's the administrator or administratrix of the state, that authority is granted to her vis-a-vis a will, would it not be? Do you know in this case?
Sorry, the
She's
last
the
part.
administrator of the estate
Yeah.
for the husband. Is that not granted to her through a will? Through what power is she granted?
Someone who's a beneficiary cannot be
Powers of
administrator in a will.
Yeah, so it would be through the will.
And if I understand correctly, wills are in contract. What you saying?
Doesn't have to go necessarily through a will.
What's
It could have been a letters of probate, and the court might have assigned her as an executive.
Right, but she
of the
granted her
state.
power vis-a-vis a will.
But the will is not
Will's
the
not a
contract.
contract. How do they confer power to her? How does she use the power to enforce the
Well,
will?
so this is, we're going into a bit of property
Okay,
law.
okay.
So for our purposes, the will can confer the power to her to administer the land, the estate, sorry. And that, in that capacity, she can argue for specific performance. I'm going to skip down a bit to agency. But I'll segue this way. You looked at Beswick and Tweedle. Yeah.
Could she ask for damages?
What has she lost?
That's my question. Like, it's concerned with owning property.
Yep.
And, but now we are contracts.
Yep.
So, the usual remedy that comes with contract would be damages.
But you have to have a loss.
Right.
And my question remains, what has she lost that she would need damages for?
My issue with this is, I have a little vision, because she's not, she doesn't have credit,
Right.
so the court gave her privity only as being the executor.
Yeah, well, I think this goes a bit to Enrico's point, and probably Nicholas. So the questions, I think, are centering around property, the influence of property on this case. Because as the administratrix of the estate, in wills, as a subset of property law, there are certain rights conferred on her. Then the question is, why are we looking at it in contract, let's say? We're looking at it because, one, Beswick reasserts that there's privity of contract, and therefore she cannot sue. But to complete the entirety of the ruling, she could get a remedy because she was the administratrix of the estate.
She cannot sue in her personal capacity,
Yeah.
but she can sue as an administrator.
Her husband's,
On behalf
she's
of the
stepping in
estate.
she's basically her husband, like a litigation guardian of her husband. She's stepping in his place. So it's as if he's suing the nephew to say, you have to do this. So it seems a bit contract-y, I understand, but in terms of damages in these facts. I don't see how she could get damages from it.
Yeah, she wants the contract to be fulfilled. She
She,
doesn't want to
but
terminate.
the court,
contract.
if I could just push forward a bit with what I think you're getting at, like, if she's lost something, she's lost legal fees and so on, but the court can award costs, right? They don't need damages.
I was confused because at the beginning you said that that changes the privity of contract, the privity.
No, I asked if Beswick does.
Oh, so
And it doesn't.
this is where I,
Yeah, and so the question was, does Beswick change privity? The answer is no. It maintains it, but happily for everyone, the evil nephew is defeated.
Sorry, I'm a little confused.
Yeah.
I know we're talking about contracts, but then I've been hearing administratrix,
Yeah.
and I want to understand if there's a distinction between that word and somebody who is an executor or executrix.
Yeah, it'd be the same thing.
Okay, that brings me to my question now.
Okay.
Under wills, can somebody who is an executor or executrix be a benefactor or a beneficiary to that will?
My understanding is no.
Okay.
But is
So-
that the difference in the term? Administrator can be a beneficiary? I don't know, Will.
No, I don't think so, because wills that I did, somebody who is an executor cannot at the same time be a beneficiary
Right.
of a will.
Yeah.
So in this particular instance, how is the administratrix, suing? Like I'm really confused. I don't get it.
Okay, well, again, I don't think it's necessarily a contract issue,
Okay.
this. What I would say is, in this case, she was allowed to sue because she was in the place of her husband, making sure that everything was done according to his wishes. And it just so happened that she was also a beneficiary, so to speak, of his will.
Okay.
Well, I understand it a little bit different, but correct me if I'm wrong. As an executor, she was suing on behalf of the estate for the fulfillment of the contract. And the contract actually was yielding for the estate. That's all that she did.
Okay, for the estate.
For the estate, that's all what she did. And then, being the executor of the estate, she collected on the contract and she gave herself money. Rightfully so.
You are allowed to be a benefactor and administrator.
Yeah, of course.
You are allowed to do both.
Yeah.
So there's no conflict.
You can be a trustee and the executor at the same
You
time.
just can't witness the will. You can't participate. But you can be.
This is why I don't like property.
I like the property, but not the law.
No?
You're a property.
I haven't heard that before.
Property is good, it's healthy.
So, as I said, moving to agency and the New Zealand shipping case. So, with this idea of privity of contract, we're told in no uncertain terms that you have to be a party to the contract in order to enforce the rights. How then do we get the ruling in New Zealand shipping?
I think, so the third party was working for the career, so it was implied that the contract covered all the parties, so the parties and those that would allow.
It wasn't implied, clause 1 of the bill of lading said carrier was acting as an agent or trustee on behalf of its servants or any independent contractors whom it might hire.
Yes, but actually the court enforced the clause, allowed the independent contractors to enforce the clause
Right.
against
Because, so factually what's happened here is,
Because you're acting as agents?
yeah. So here, something's being shipped, I forget what it was. And it's not damaged during the shipping process, but it's actually damaged in the unloading process. And there's an agreement between the shippee and the shipper, if you will, that if anything happens, there's insurance, they're indemnified. But in these facts, it wasn't the shippee that caused the damage, it was people hired by the shippee to unload the goods. So arguably in privity of contract, the independent contractors were not party to that, therefore they should be liable. They are not indemnified. And so Constantina told us that they were, and I pointed out clause 1 of the Bill of Lading that basically extended the indemnity to servants or any independent contractors it might hire. So the indemnity on the shippee was extended to the workers who unloaded the goods. I know Dayon's answer to this. Is that clear? I know it's not. Or if something isn't clear or it's not, it's confusing, ask and I'll try to unpack that.
So if there was no clause, and
They probably would have been liable. But because of this clause,
So it's not like there is a rule when somebody's acting for somebody else as an agent.
no, it's construction of the contract. I think I'll leave it there. Oh, sorry, Nicholas.
I was going to say this has to be a narrow exception, right? Because it really goes against the system.
Mhm.
There's no contract between the people, actually the independent contractors in this case,
Yep.
and the shipper. And now we somehow say there is a contractual obligation. So what's the reason for that?
Because of the clause. So if we look at, and this is where we're going to next after the break.
Yeah, but these parties didn't enter into this contract. There's someone. in
No, but
between.
the two parties that did enter into the contract had this clause, clause 1, that said, basically, the indemnity on us as shippers, the people carrying the stuff, extends to anyone that we hire to unload the goods.
Understood, but it obviously goes against the systematic or the privity rule.
Yeah.
Well, you can confer benefits to a third party through the contract between two unrelated persons.
Yet I don't think it goes against it here.
You know, this is about the benefit, not about the debt.
I mean,
Nobody's burdened here.
following the case of Trada, actually, in Trada case also is confer benefit on the groom. I mean, the two father confer benefit on the groom, but that case is decided differently. So, I mean,
Right, but the son was suing there, and the question is in, what the hell was the case?
Trada.
New Zealand shipping.
Yeah, but they didn't have a contract to indemnify nobody. This is a big difference. If you have a contract to indemnify even a third party, it's a completely different situation.
You see, indemnify births begins the kind of conferment of kind of benefit on third party, and whether the third party can claim the benefit is the question.
Well,
Indemnification.
in this case, I would say what happened was the plaintiff couldn't sue the third party because of the contract it entered into with the defendant. If that makes sense.
Contracted out of the tribute.
Yeah. So by operation of the contract, they avoided the privity issue. So, back to Nicholas's point, and I'll come to you. Nicholas is saying, well, doesn't that unsettle everything? I'm sort of exaggerating.
Yeah, I mean,
And what I'm saying is it doesn't, because what supersedes, what are some of the themes that we've talked about? One of them is freedom to contract. And in the common law, you can contract however you want. And in this particular contract, the parties turn their attention to the possibility of third parties being involved in something, because it was quite an open-ended clause. And so this was giving effect to the will of the parties. Whereas in the other privity cases, the will of the parties wasn't necessarily to draw that person in or make somebody in Tweedle to make them a party to the contract. It was a contract in itself. And even though you're the subject of the contract, if you're not party to it, you can't sue for those rights. But in New Zealand shipping, they were barred from suing the third party by operation of the bill of lading, the contract.
But they can sue the ship owner, right?
They were indemnified too, right? So they were out of luck, or SOL as we say in North America. You can look that up. Ebra and then
Yeah,
Emily.
so in this case, New Zealand shipping code, the agent was covered by a clause. In the
Clause
bill.
one, yeah, in the contract.
What if I'm acting as an agent, I'm not like covered by a clause in the.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. So the stevedores, as they were called in the case, were agents for the shipper, the shipping company. But they were indemnified because of the clause. So there isn't a general rule necessarily that if you're an agent, you're indemnified. The point is that the stevedores were acting as agents for the shipping company, and the contract covered them.
Just because the contract covered them.
Yeah.
So, if we don't have this clause one,
Yeah.
but there was a same clause one between the shipping company and the person who's hired to upload
Yeah.
the dream. So, could the other company sue the person who was hired?
No, so in your example, if the shipping company and the loaders had a contract that indemnified the loaders, and the loaders damaged the goods, is this what you're
Yeah.
saying? Could the person who had the goods shipped sue the shipping company?
No, the person who loaded the dream.
No, they have to sue the shipping company in that case, and they'd be free to do so because the contract is only between the shipping company and the people unloading the shipment.
Okay, and in this case, the shipping company can go back and sue the person who hired because of the
Yeah.
law.
Yeah, so it gets a bit complicated, but in terms of the way the litigation would go, the shipper, the person who owned the goods would sue the unloader company, and they'd say, you can't sue us, and they draw in the shipping company as a third party, and say, you have to sue them, we have a contract with them, anything that we might have done wrong, it's their problem. So that's technically how it would work. You don't need to know that, I'm just sort of explaining.
Or the shipping company would defend the loader
Maybe, yeah.
instead of going through a third party.
Yeah, but if they were reluctant,
It's the same principle as the insurance. Insurance is pretty much indemnification. You sue the driver at fault for the accident,
yeah,
you're suing personally, but then the insurer is defending the action because there is a clause for indemnification.
In the last one,
I have.
sorry.
There's a similar issue in real estate law, I think. If a property owner wants to make some renovation in his house or property and hires a general contractor, a builder, and the builder hires a subcontractor to do some renovation, such as carpentry or something.
Right.
And if the general contractor does not pay the
Subcontractor.
pay to the subcontractor can register a lien on the property. So normally there is no
I
contract.
don't know if they can register a lien. I know that the contractor has to keep certain money aside under
Yes,
statute
10%.
for this purpose. I think they could put a lien against the company or any assets of the contractor.
Lien against the property.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, but I'm not fluent in real estate law.
But in this case, there is no contractual relationship between the house owner and the subcontractor.
Right, but there are certain public policy points that are dealt with by statute for that point, I know, because of how many contractors don't pay subcontractors. The very last one.
So this case gives us an exception to the rule, but third parties cannot.
It's a borderline. I don't know if I couldn't call it an exception, because, well, I guess technically you could call it an exception because the unloaders were not party to the contract.
But it's important that they were sued. That they would, a clause that would not give a benefit to third parties to sue against. So a third party could not sue somebody when he's not part of it.
Right. But
only in this case that they were being sued.
Yeah. So, and I note this in the notes, in England, there's a third party, I forget the full name, that allows for third parties to sue where there's an issue of privity of contract. So in Canada, the only way around it really is for Canada to take, or Ontario to take similar steps, legislative steps.
There is no.
No. But all the Canadian textbooks refer to England, so I'm just noting why. Can we do it after the break? Because I have very angry people, I think. We'll pick up with performance. I have 35, so come back at 55. I think Dayon said it takes 20 minutes to get coffee at a Roma. Oftentimes I find in textbooks they will sort of combine performance and termination. I think that overlooks some key elements. So I look at performance as being a bit more about interpretation of the contract, which is something we'll pick up on again tomorrow. But performance, I think the question is looking at, well, what's obligated of the parties? So I've given you a quotation from Edwin Peel. The right to terminate a contract arises where a breach goes to the root of the contract and where the breach is of a condition without regard to the magnitude of the breach. This makes breach of a condition an exception to the requirement of substantial failure in performance. Reading that quotation, it focuses only on termination. But I think the key question is, what is a breach that goes to the root of the contract? That involves interpretation of the contract. What is happening? What are the terms? And so what I'm going to start off with is looking at some, I would say, important concepts in terms of performance. For example, order of performance. Condition precedent, concurring conditions, independent promises. These all deal with different ways of arranging the obligations. So a condition precedent, one party has to perform before the other party becomes liable to perform. Concurrent conditions, the parties undertake to perform concurrently or simultaneously. Independent promises. And then we have this thing called the entire obligations rule, which is different from condition precedent in that in the entire obligations rule, a party must perform entirely their obligation before it triggers the other party's reciprocal obligation to perform. And an example would be Cutter and Powell. A very old case, but Cutter was a sailor on a ship, and he was due to be paid once he returned with the ship. So they leave England. I forget where they were going. I think it was South America, but I'm not sure. So he leaves England. I'm dealing with Cutter and Powell.
What is it?
Sorry?
No, I'm trying to find.
So we're dealing with performance.
Is it in the notes?
Yeah.
Five performance
We have a note called performance in brief.
Yes.
Order of performance. Condition precedent. Okay, you don't have the Cutter and Powell. Okay. I don't know why. My apologies. I'll send that out in an email then. So Cutter and Powell is, as I said, Cutter is a sailor, and he only gets paid once he's made the return trip back to England. But he dies, I think he actually dies like 3 days away from England, as it turns out. So his widow sues the ship and says, well, you know, he did most of it. And the court says he had an entire, that the contract was arranged in a way that he had to perform his obligation in its entirety before the ship had to pay him. So that's an example of the entire obligation rule, where one party has to perform in its entirety before the other party's obligation is triggered. Today, we would look at that a bit differently. So we could sever the obligation, and as I said, I'll send after class the notes that I have. Oh, is it?
Before section 1 performance, it's just one paragraph. It's here.
Okay.
Before section?
Before section 1 performance. It's just one paragraph.
Yeah, but not in Cutter and Powell.
Yes. That's what it says. Case Cutter and Powell, sailor died 3 days before reaching the shore in UK on the trip back. Widow didn't have a right to receive.
I think it's re-edited this now.
Really?
Yeah. I edited this, so I put this.
Okay.
On the book.
So, again, just to be clear, I'll send this in an email, but the point is very discreet. Entire obligations rule, Cutter and Powell. Moving on. Today, we would look at this a bit differently in an employment circumstance. For example, you don't have to perform your whole career before you get paid. You're paid on a monthly or weekly basis. So it's a severable obligation. So you could sever the obligation. In Cutter and Powell, there's a concept called quantum meruit, where it says you are paid for the work you have done. So Cutter, let's say, will be paid 90% of his wage instead of the full 100%. So I think, just looking at the note, where it picks up next is the 3 classifications. Is that right? And you have Bettini and Guy underneath. So what's happening in Bettini and Guy?
There was an agreement between Tenor and Opera House that he would perform only, he would not perform within a distance from, he would only perform to this opera and not any other within some distance, 50 miles to London, and that he would be 6 days before rehearsals without...
He'd arrive in London.
Yes, he would arrive in London 6 days before rehearsals. So the tenor did not fulfill this term, and he arrived 2 days before his performance. And then Frederick Guy sought termination of the contract because of this, because he failed to fulfill this term. And the issue is whether he could, if he was entitled to termination of the contract or only damages.
Okay. So
whether the term was a condition, so the issue was...
did it go to the root
root
of the contract? So the singer, Bettini, not arriving 6 days before rehearsals, but Bettini was available for the 4-month period of performances. Guy said you came late and you can't perform anything. As Constantina said, was Bettini's tardiness in arriving something that allowed Guy to terminate the contract? So we're interpreting the contract here. I know you don't have the contract before you, but if the terms are sort of loosely, you have to arrive in London 6 days before, early for rehearsals, and you will be here to perform over a 4-month period. What is a breach that goes to the root of the contract? And here we have this specific point that Bettini only arrives, 2 days before rehearsals?
Yes.
Does that constitute a failure that goes to the root of the contract? Put it maybe in simpler terms, how big a deal is this?
Not big a deal.
He didn't miss a performance.
Okay, so if we sort of legal it up a bit, we're saying that Guy didn't have a right to terminate the contract.
Yes, in a way, because it didn't go to the root of the contract. You know, like how is that going to affect, his performance in, in 4 months? I mean, in a way, it doesn't really, it didn't go to the root of the contract, because it should have been a separate issue if probably he came after when he was supposed to come to, start the rehearsals, or he came, after when he was supposed to, do one of the performances, then it would have gone to the root of the contract.
From the point of where the court does not treat every favor in some way, it will look into the breach.
Why does it look into the breach? Why?
Because I think the main, usually the court wants not to terminate the contracts. Usually they want to keep the contract,
Right.
and preserve the contract whenever it's possible.
So that, Zita's point goes to this issue, I would say. What about freedom to contract? The parties agreed that Bettini would be there 6 days before. This is a term. It's been breached. Therefore, end of the story. It should be done. Zita's point is, well, we have to investigate what was breached because the courts, if possible, are going to look at how to preserve the contract. And this is something we're going to look at through a few cases. So here they say, no, this doesn't go to the root of the contract. Does that mean then that Bettini gets off?
It's the why with damages, isn't it?
Yeah. So maybe Bettini loses some pay, whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
So what we're talking about is there is a breach. How serious is the breach? That level of seriousness will tell us how to treat the breach. Whether or not it's a small breach, let's say, that has damages, or does it go to the root of the contract? We're using the loose terminology from the late 19th century here.
Isn't that an assessment that's too subjective?
How? That the court can't make the assessment, you're saying?
I'm saying it's too subjective.
Subjective.
What I can consider as, okay, this goes to the root of the agreement, the root of the contract. You might not.
Yep. So that's why I posed the question that I did with Bettini and Guy. What about freedom to contract? Why can't Guy say, you didn't arrive on time, you're out?
Right.
And the answer was anticipated by Zita, that the courts are going to preserve contracts where possible, that not every breach allows a party to terminate the contract. Because then, basically, we would have a lot of technicalities where people are saying, well, that's a breach.
But it's an outline stipulated term of the contract. Why then do we need to try and fish out whether or not this is so important as opposed to...
Let me put it to the classroom. Why would the courts delve into this?
I think there are many terms in the contract, so like the more essential the less is not all, like if every breach of every term could amount to
A reason to terminate.
could be a reason to terminate, could be maybe too unfair for the other part for a small breach the other guy to find a way to avoid his contractual obligations in the entirety where the result of termination is not reasonable. Like in the present case, so the tenor was at the rehearsal, was like available, but he was 2 days before and not 6. It doesn't, I don't know, common sense, I think it doesn't seem right to terminate the whole contract because of such a small, and I think if it was explicit in the contract that in the case of this breach, the other party can terminate the contract, then we would, the court
Even
would,
then,
So, because I would make this distinction when, like, there were 100, like, maybe a lot of terms, and when it's not explicit that this term is so significant that a breach of it would be a reason for termination, then that's why courts can assess what was reasonable. But if they say that this term is very important, then I think that the courts entering in the freedom of contract, that is unreasonable. To say we don't care if you signed this term was significant, we don't consider it as going to the root of the contract.
I could use that same point, freedom to contract, to say this guy, the tenor, not guy, he knew what he was getting into. He wasn't coerced. Also, if guy was put in a, if he had a burden by the tenor showing up 2 days as opposed to 6, he was put in a lesser position. Let's say he had to pay someone because of this lateness. Isn't that like reason enough to ensure that the contract is now null and void, breached?
So let's go, I was going to work up to it, but let's go to the Hong Kong fur shipping case. It is under the heading the nominate term. I think I gave you the full case note on this.
Which case is it?
Hong Kong Fur Shipping versus Kawasaki Eisen Taisha. So this is a pivotal case and goes to the discussion we've been having. Factually, we have a 24-month contract, 2-year contract. A charter party, for those who don't know, is where you, forgive the term, rent a ship. So the renter of the ship has the ship for 24 months. It turned out later on during the life of that contract that the ship was unseaworthy. It needed extensive repairs, the crew was incompetent. So they lost about 20 weeks, which I think was about, what, 4 months? 5 months? So that reduces to 24 months by, I think we can say, a significant enough amount. So if you are the charter party, you're representing them, you say, this goes to the root of the contract. The contract was for 2 years. I can't use the ship, just to use round numbers, for a quarter of the time. So that should allow me to terminate the contract. I can't use the ship. But the Court of Appeal said no. That this didn't go to the root of the contract. It allowed for damages, not termination. Why did the court decide this way?
I think this very requirement is willing to reduce the person from having the benefits of the contract itself.
It deprived them of the benefit of the contract, but not the substantial benefit of the contract. And I use that term because that's what the court says. So it did not deprive the charter party of substantially the whole benefit of the contract. What does that mean?
It is beneficial for both parties and the gain. The benefit of the contract is actually what he expected the contract has been performed, but maybe there is a slightly bit difference.
Yeah, I would quibble with the slight.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's more than slight, but the point here is the charter party had it for, using my round numbers, 3/4 of the time. They lost 1/4 of the time. And the Court of Appeal is saying that is substantially the benefit of the contract. And in that case, you cannot terminate, terminate for breach of what's called a condition. This is breach of a warranty. A condition will be the term we use for breach of a term that goes to the root of the contract, using the Bettini and Guy language. Breach of a warranty does not. It's breach of a lesser term. And the way that difference is assessed in Hong Kong first is by the court saying you have to be, you the innocent party, have to be substantially deprived of the benefit of the contract. So going to our point between Yannick and Constantina, what does this case tell us? It tells us that the courts are going to preserve contracts where possible. They're going to enforce contracts, but they're not going to let the breaching party off the hook. There are damages that will be awarded to compensate the innocent party. But what the court is saying is, and this echoes what I was talking about last week, we take very seriously that the parties will be held to the bargains they sign up to. So you cannot come to us and say, and this was an example from Hong Kong Furs, a door doesn't work on the ship, or a few nails are out. It's unseaworthy. You can't come to us and say you can terminate. We're going to apply a higher threshold, basically, to allow you to terminate, and that threshold is you have to be deprived of substantially the full benefit of the contract. Minus that, you will be awarded damages, but you cannot terminate the contract.
I get the distinction and I appreciate the significance, but what's the practical effect here for the claimant, for the plaintiff? Presumably, claiming damages in this instance wouldn't have put it in any worse a position than it would have been had it terminated and claimed damages.
So I think, so let's put it this way. The charter party comes to you and says, I want to terminate.
Unless they have no need for the ship any longer.
Yeah. I would say the problem is this. If we proceed, as in Hong Kong Furs, and treat this as a termination, and we're wrong, we've breached the contract, and we're in a position of liability. So what's being gambled with is exposure to liability in this case. So taking that step of saying, this is such a bad breach that it allows me to terminate, is actually quite a significant decision for the innocent party to undertake. Because they have to be, put crudely, pretty sure that they're right. Otherwise, if they're wrong, as in Hong Kong Furs, they've breached. They've refused payment. And whatever else flows from that loss. So the importance of the interpretation of the contract here, the interpretation of what constitutes performance, goes to the idea of this, as I said last week, the philosophy of the common law courts with contracts. They're going to preserve the contracts, the agreements where possible, to the extent that here, arguably, we have a bad breach. You can't use the ship for a significant period of time. But the courts say, well, that's not enough. Basically, it's almost like a math question. If they had less than 12 months when they could use the ship, maybe then there's an argument for substantial deprivation.
It's too vague.
So
Sorry?
50%.
It's too nebulous, it's too vague, there's nothing.
Well, you see, instead of looking at it as vague, what I'm saying is the instruction we're getting from the case is the courts are going to err on the side of if they can preserve the contract and award only damages and not allow for the termination and damages from that, they will do so. And this goes back, as I said, to the importance the courts place on formation of the contract. Once you're in it, we, speaking as the courts, don't want you to come here and say you don't like it anymore, or find some reason, in their opinion, to try to get out of a bargain that doesn't work for them anymore.
I mean, they don't even do that with marriages.
With
marriages.
Yeah, well,
You go there.
I think we've seen how the law looks at marriage with intention. Yeah.
Does it play a role the reason why they rent the ship? So let's say that they want to use that mostly the first month. So, and then...
But you don't rent a ship to look at it.
Yeah, but...
Right? Like, I'm not trying to be silly,
Yeah.
but you rent it for 2 years. Presumably, you have something going on. So if you can't use it for a quarter of the time, it doesn't mean that the reason for renting the ship goes away.
It depends.
Okay?
So, yeah, but my question is, does that reason, if it's important for them to use that the first part of the time, does it play a role to this ruling or not? If they can prove that it is important for them to have the ship the first part of the time.
I don't think that would change the rule. Because, let's say they lost the first quarter of the time, but got the last 3 quarters. They still have substantially the whole benefit of the contract. Unless there are other facts that come into play there. Edward, you have anything?
Yeah, for me, this decision seemed like the court's trying to protect the ship owners more than the charterers.
Who is
Because
innocent.
it said that she was later found to be unseaworthy.
Yeah.
So, yeah, for example, like I'm renting a ship,
Yeah.
yeah, to be able like to ship around the world.
Yeah.
For example, so to be unseaworthy, so I cannot use it. It's not like there's like problem with the engine and the ship cannot like proceed in
Yeah.
a certain speed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. In that case, I can understand that's okay, not like a significant breach of the contract, but to be like unseaworthy, that's definitely like a significant breach of the
And that's what I was saying though. And even with that, the court is ruling the way it did. So my point to underline it is the court is making not just a decision, but telling us how it approaches these scenarios.
Is a breach, sorry, is for misrep. Will the courts ever?
For misrepresentation?
Yeah, sorry.
We'll deal with it. But, so misrepresentation, if you don't know, is where one party, think of Donald Trump. And he tells you this is the best, biggest, brightest, whatever it is. And it turns out he's misrepresented. What does the court do? Well, the court says that's very important because it goes to the formation of the contract. You entered into the contract, you, the innocent party, with Donald, under false pretenses. You were misled intentionally. So we will allow you to get out of the contract there. That's something we look at under vitiating factors, and misrepresentation in particular is at the end. But here, what the court is saying is, if we don't have a vitiating factor, like economic duress or misrepresentation, if what we have is about the performance of the contract, we are going to err on the side of preserving the contract where possible.
How is this reconciled with the rule in Powell, like Carter and Powell? Because in there the rule was that the contract, it has to be performed in its entirety before the application is issued.
Don't be a sailor in the 17th to 19th centuries. Right. I think it's the rule.
But in here, like the court basically overruling that.
Yeah,
the way how I understand it.
It is a bit different. Remember Stilk and Myrick yesterday? That was the case where they lost 2 sailors out of 11.
Right.
The captain promised the wages of those 2 and then said, I was just kidding. And the court said, well, it's not enforceable, that promise. So the sailors didn't get the extra money. And the House of Lords went into this thing about how public policy rationale, we don't want sailors holding captain's ransom. I would say Cutter and Powell is similarly harsh for that reason. We also have to look at the lapse of time between those cases and now, with what we're looking at with Hong Kong Furs. And Hong Kong Furs is telling us, especially when there are 2 commercial parties, we are going to not allow people to get out of contracts very easily. And this I think is a real significant case for that reason. Because if I'm the lawyer for the charter party, I don't want to tell my client, I'm sorry, we can't terminate. You imagine telling someone that they can't use the ship for a quarter of the time, and that's not a breach that allows them to terminate the contract. Going to Ebra's point as well.
Is there any dissent?
No.
I was going to say, just so hypothetically, again, theory, if you use like the lens from Hong Kong case and use it towards Cutter and Powell, would you think that the decision would have been different then? I guess because
I think Cutter and Powell today, as I said, would have been quantum meruit, meaning he would have been paid for what he had done up until the point he couldn't work anymore.
I was going to say, basically, like how in this case, pretty much it was available for exception once out of 24. And whereas it was like basically, let's say he died a month, like he was out of sea for like 11 months.
Yeah, so it's a difference between employment and the commercial contract here. So the court is saying, okay, you, the charter party, don't have to pay for, probably don't have to pay for the full 24 months. You arrange it with the parties, but we're not going to allow you to terminate the contract and sue for breaches flowing from, sue for damages flowing from that breach. We're only going to allow you to sue for what you lost because of the breach of contract. Nothing more. So that's why I brought it up now, and I skipped ahead, because we were getting into this conversation of, well, what's the demarcation point? And I think Hong Kong Furs really firmly tells us where the demarcation point is. And that is, if you're the innocent party, you have to think very long and hard about your argument for suing for breach leading, breach of a contract leading to termination. What's called a repudiatory breach. And I have a lot of sympathy for the charter party in the Hong Kong Furs case. If we can't use something that we contracted for a quarter of the time, surely that must be reason to terminate. But the court is saying no here. And keep in mind, it's within the commercial context. In a consumer context, today we have the Consumer Protection Act that operates differently. But largely what we're looking at here are commercial contracts.
Just coming back to putting it in perspective, and I'm trying to get a sense of where you have conditions, you have warranty, and you have in the middle inanimate terms.
Yep,
And
innominate terms.
Right, we're really talking about those terms right now, rather than condition, which is normally clear. If you breach those, then
Yeah.
and then you have warranty, which is by damages.
See, it isn't that clear.
So why are we making the distinction of the three classification and then delving? In
Because
these
that's the
cases, they delve-
language that the court is using to convey a message. So I'll draw your attention to the Schuler versus Wickman case, because you bring up what, inferentially, I think you're bringing up, there's power to these terms. And what I'm saying is they're not definitive. So if the parties, as in Schuler, say this is a condition, the court says that's nice. We're going to look at it and assess whether or not that's a condition. It's an indication of what the parties intended, but it's not necessarily how the court is going to treat it. So that's why I say in answer to your question, these classifications of a condition, warranty, and innominate term, and I've given you a diagram to illustrate the point. These are ways of talking about breaches. So we've been talking about why couldn't the charter party in Hong Kong Furs argue breach of a condition? The court called it a breach of a warranty. Or if they didn't assign any sort of terminology, innominate term where it could be a condition or warranty. This is the language that we use to understand what we're talking about. But it in itself is not necessarily determinative or final. And the Schuler case tells us that.
So ultimately, it's a question of how serious the consequences.
Right. And on top of that, what I'm saying is, if you have a situation where you're representing the innocent party, think about Hong Kong Furs. Because Hong Kong Furs says you have to think about what was lost here. What was the breach? Did you lose substantially the benefit of the contract? Because if not, it looks as though the court is going to say you get damages, but not for a repudiatory breach. So it's an instructive case that then, I'm not going through all the cases, these other cases add to, they fill in further details. Let's look at the Seahab versus Bremner case, the Hansen Nord. It is the fifth case under the innominate term. Seahab, C-E-H-A-V-E.
1.45.
Yeah, I have all my notes in one file, so.
It's right after the Schuler.
Sorry?
It's right after the Schuler.
Yeah. This I find is kind of an interesting case for illustrating what we're talking about. I think I gave you the case brief, didn't I?
Yeah.
So largely the case briefs I write. Sometimes I'll get it from somewhere, I think, but largely I try to give you what I've summarized. So this case concerned citrus pulp pellets. I have no idea what those are. But somebody buys them and somebody sells them.
Gets so fast. Gets so fast.
So,
Especially if they're on sale.
so the buyer rejects the cargo of citrus pulp pellets because they were less than perfect. So the seller, having lost the buyer, resells them at auction. And it just so happens that the buyer at auction is the original buyer. So the original buyer rejects those goods and buys it at about 33% of what he would have bought it at. Is this a breach of a condition? Could the buyer do this? The court rejected that argument. And basically said, well, Lord Denning comes back, as he does a lot. It says, buyers should not have a right to reject the whole cargo unless the deficiency was serious and substantial. The other opinion, contracts are made to be performed and not avoided according to the whims of market fluctuation. And where there is free choice between two possible constructions, I think the court should tend to prefer that construction which will ensure performance and not encourage avoidance of contractual obligations. So here, we're getting some more details of the thinking of the courts regarding performance and when a party can reject goods and say, this contract doesn't work anymore, you didn't fulfill your obligations, and your breach was so bad that I can terminate the contract. Well, here we see an example of a party taking advantage of that situation, because clearly those pellets were worth buying.
Yeah, but not for the price.
Right, but rejecting them and then buying them at a substantial discount doesn't look very good, as it is in this case. So there has to be a reason that was serious and substantial, in Lord Denning's words, for the party to reject those goods. So here we see an example of the court saying, look, we're not going to let people just get out of contracts for whatever reason. Maybe you didn't like the quality of the pellets. Then deal with it amongst yourselves. But don't reject them and then circle back at auction and buy them later. This, in Roskill's opinion, it looked like an attempt to avoid the contract. And the courts won't stand for that. They sort of have a low threshold of tolerance for that. Yeah.
But in this case, if you treat it as a breach of condition or breach of warrant, whether this classification make any difference because the good is auction, so presumably the auction price is a kind of market price. So the difference?
The auction price wouldn't be a market price.
But if we treat it as a breach of warrant, then the party still can claim a damage. So what will be the damage decided?
So here, what the court is saying is the original contract should have been upheld, but you can modify the price because of the quality. But you don't have a right to essentially reject the goods or treat this as a termination.
Unless there is a specific term that buyer at its own consideration and sole discretion can reject. In that case,
which would be unlikely.
Well, but it is possible.
Yeah. So, and why I say auction wouldn't be a market price, when things go to auction, it's sort of like, sorry?
The highest price.
Yeah, they're getting rid of it. It's a way of just, we're cutting our losses.
But if auction was not the case, like if auction was not involved in this case, would the court still have a problem with rejection?
I think so, especially if it was the same buyer that circled back somehow and bought it. Like, that just looks kind of suspicious, I think. I think the court, reading into it, the court was not impressed
No,
with the conduct.
The auction court was not.
No, I understand, but what I'm saying is, taking out the option, if it was the buyer that still circled back and got it at a substantial discount, I think the court would still find the same way.
Are you familiar with the concept of the actio quanti minoris? You've mentioned the reduction in the purchase price.
Yeah, so explain it.
Pardon me?
Explain it.
Well, essentially, a right of a buyer of goods to effectively claim a discount when there's a defect in the goods, which is a Roman law concept. I don't know. I've just done a quick Google and I see there's something about the Sale of Goods Act of 1979, which is
that's the UK.
That's the English sale, but this is an English case, isn't it? That's a 79.
So in 75 they were dealing with the 1893 Act.
Oh, I see. Okay. So it wouldn't have been an option because it'd be pretty harsh outcome not to pay the full 100,000 when it's in fact worth, whether it's a third or whether it's 75%.
Well, that was the point I was saying, right? The court isn't telling them you have to pay that price. They're saying you didn't have a reason to reject in this way. So they're saying there's scope between these two things, saying I'm walking away and accepting. And the court is saying you just walked away immediately and it turned out that they were okay for you after all.
I hear. I'm just saying, I guess the outcome in this, we don't know enough about the case, but it doesn't look like there was an alternative remedy sought by the plaintiff, with the result that they actually end up paying the full price, and there's no sort of equity being applied here by the judges by the looks of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Was that just a problem that the lawyers had to, and the plaintiff had to deal with ultimately? It seems a harsh outcome because what the court is saying, yes, you ought to have asked for a discount, but frankly, you're paying the full price.
I didn't think they were saying...
Because I think the remedy sought was a cancellation. So I guess unless they order...
They were still of merchantable quality. And the court is saying, under the Sale of Goods Act, there's an implied term that what you're selling is of merchantable quality. What the price of that could be deviated, and maybe there is something in the contract about that. But the court is objecting to just the outright rejection.
It's okay. I mean, I was really just trying to suggest that the outcome seems a bit harsh. The problem here is the claimant says, I want a complete cancellation, and doesn't seem to ask for an alternative remedy, i.e. a reduction in the purchase price. And the outcome for the plaintiff is, sorry, you've got to pay the full purchase price. Because you didn't actually negotiate for a discount. That seems to be the outcome.
Yeah, I didn't take it necessarily as that strict from the court. I thought it was more along the lines of what I think you're saying is they factored in it might be too harsh to make you pay 100%, but you, the parties, then work out exactly what it is, but it's not going to be 33%.
Okay.
So tomorrow, we'll pick up with anticipatory breach, anticipatory repudiation, and then I forget what's the next topic. It's interpretation.